The winter of 1888 came down on the Northwood settlement like a hammer. It was not a gentle descent into slumber, cushioned by the grace of autumn. It was a sudden, violent arrival, a shattering of peace. The cold did not knock before it entered. It kicked the door from its hinges and stalked through the thin-walled cabins, a thief of warmth and a harbinger of fear. For the families huddled in this remote valley, carved from a wilderness that barely tolerated their presence, winter was more than a season. It was a siege, an annual war waged against an enemy that could not be fought, only endured. The primary weapon of this enemy was not the snow, which fell in blinding, silent sheets, nor the wind, which screamed through the pines like a legion of ghosts. The true weapon was the ground itself. The earth, which in summer gave life, became a traitor in winter. The frost drove its crystalline fingers deep into the soil, and with an irresistible, silent power, it heaved. The ground swelled and buckled, a slow-motion earthquake that lasted for months. It was a force that mocked the ambitions of men, a power that treated their homes like toys. The central conflict, the one that defined life and death in Northwood, was the battle against this inexorable movement. Every cabin in the settlement was built upon the same principle, a design passed down from the first settlers, who had themselves learned it from others farther south. A shallow foundation of stacked fieldstones, laid in a trench dug a mere 2 or 3 feet deep, was meant to provide stability. It was the accepted wisdom, the only way anyone knew how to build, and every year it failed. The frost would creep beneath these shallow footings, grip them in a fist of ice, and lift. The movement was never uniform. One corner of a cabin might rise an inch, while another sank half as much. The sturdy log walls, chinked with mud and moss against the wind, would groan under the torsional stress.
Seams would open, invisible cracks widening into hungry mouths that invited the Arctic air inside. Doors would refuse to close, their frames twisted into parallelograms. Windows would shatter, the sound of their breaking like a pistol shot in the frozen silence of the night. The struggle was universal, a shared condition of misery that bound the community together. Every family knew the ritual. They burned through mountains of cordwood, feeding stoves that glowed cherry red but could not conquer the chill that poured through the walls. The heat rose to the rafters, leaving the floors dangerously cold, a place where spilled water would turn to a glaze of ice in minutes. Children were kept swaddled in blankets, their faces pale in the flickering firelight. The air was thick with the smell of wood smoke and the palpable tension of survival.
They were all fighting the same losing battle, patching the same cracks, and praying for the same spring thaw that would bring with it the back-breaking work of resetting their broken homes. Into this landscape of shared hardship came Elias, a man who moved with a quiet deliberation that some mistook for slowness. He was a widower, having arrived the previous summer with his young daughter, Anna, a small girl with eyes as serious and watchful as her father's. He had purchased a plot of land at the edge of the settlement, a rocky piece of ground that others had passed over. He spoke little, offering polite nods, but volunteering no stories of his past. The community knew only that his wife had been lost to a fever on the trail west, and this shared language of loss was enough to grant him a measure of acceptance, if not understanding.
Elias had a background that remained unspoken, a history of working with stone and steel in mountainous terrains far away, on grand projects designed by engineers who dreamed of conquering nature. He had seen firsthand how those dreams could be shattered by the simple, patient power of ice and gravity. He had learned more from the colossal failures of educated men than most people learned from a lifetime of modest success. He understood that you did not fight the forces of the earth. You either yielded to them, or you found a place where they held no power.
As autumn began to bleed its color from the leaves, the men of Northwood began their frantic, yearly ritual of winter preparations. They felled trees, their axes ringing in the crisp air, and hastily erected new cabins or repaired old ones. They dug their shallow trenches, laid their field stones, and raised their walls in a race against the first hard frost. But Elias did not join them. He spent his days walking his plot of land, his gaze directed not at the trees, but at the ground beneath his feet. He carried a long iron rod, which he would drive into the earth, listen, pull it out, and move on. The other settlers watched him with a mixture of pity and curiosity. Silas, the settlement's most respected builder, a broad-shouldered man whose hands were maps of calluses and scars, finally approached him. "The ground will be frozen solid in a month," Silas said, his tone a blend of advice and warning. "You and the little one will need shelter." Elias nodded, his eyes not leaving the patch of ground he was studying. "I am looking for the right place to build," he replied, his voice calm and even. Silas grunted. "One patch of dirt is the same as any other here. Just dig your trench and start laying stone before it's too late." But Elias did not dig a trench. A week later, after days of probing the earth with his iron rod, he chose a spot. He cleared the brush and topsoil, but instead of marking out the rectangular footprint of a cabin, he began to dig a hole. It was not a wide excavation, but a deep, focused pit, barely 6 feet square, right in the center of his cleared space. He worked with a steady, unhurried rhythm, his shovel and pickaxe rising and falling from dawn until dusk. The community's curiosity curdled into skepticism. Men would stop by on their way back from the forest, leaning on their axes and watching him work. The hole grew deeper, far deeper than any foundation trench. It passed the frost line, then went deeper still. The pile of excavated earth grew into a small mountain beside the pit. "What are you digging for, man?" one of them called out one afternoon, a nervous laugh in his voice. "Hoping to find a warmer climate down there?" Laughter rippled through the small group of onlookers. Elias paused, wiped a sleeve across his brow, and looked up from the hole. He was now so deep that only his head and shoulders were visible. "I am digging for my foundation," he said simply. The men exchanged confused glances. Silas, who had been watching from a distance, stepped forward, his face a mask of genuine concern. "Elias, that's not a foundation. That's a well. A foundation is wide, not deep. It spreads the load. What you're doing, it makes no sense. The frost will get all around that hole and crush it like an egg." Elias shook his head, a small, almost imperceptible motion. "The frost cannot crush what it cannot move," he said, and then he turned back to his work, the rhythmic chunk of his pickaxe echoing from the pit. The laughter that followed was no longer friendly. It was derisive, the sharp-edged humor of men who see a fool at work. The hole became known as Elias's Folly. The warnings grew more pointed, more severe. They told him he was wasting precious time. They told him he was endangering his daughter. They told him his cabin, if he ever managed to build one on such a ridiculous anchor, would be torn to pieces by the first great freeze. He was a dreamer, a fool who had read too many books and had no practical sense. His idea was not just novel, it was seen as a dangerous deviation from the collective wisdom that had allowed them all to survive, however tenuously, in this harsh land. Elias worked on, seemingly deaf to their mockery and blind to their stares. He was a man possessed by a quiet, unshakable diligence. His world shrank to the dimensions of the pit he was digging. The sun would rise, casting a long shadow into the hole, and he would descend. It would set, and he would climb out, his body aching with a fatigue that went bone deep. Anna would be waiting for him at the edge of the pit with a tin cup of water, her small face a mirror of his own solemn determination. She did not understand what he was doing, but she understood him. Her trust was the only encouragement he needed. The work was brutal. After the first few feet, the soil became dense clay, studded with rocks that had to be painstakingly worked loose with a pickaxe and hauled out with a bucket and rope. He was not just digging, he was quarrying a vertical tunnel through the earth. Each day, his progress was measured in inches, not feet. The pile of excavated dirt grew larger, a testament to his relentless effort. The community watched him, and their mockery slowly gave way to a kind of grudging awe at his sheer persistence, though they remained convinced of his foolishness. He was the strongest fool they had ever seen. While Elias toiled in his pit, the rest of Northwood buzzed with the frantic energy of conventional construction. The sounds of saws and hammers filled the air. 3 new cabins went up that autumn, all built on the same flawed principle as the old ones.
Silas himself oversaw the construction of one for a newly arrived family, his voice booming instructions, his expertise unquestioned. They dug their shallow trenches, laid their stones, and stacked their logs with the confidence of men who believe they are doing things the right way. They chinked their walls with fresh mud and moss, their movements efficient and practiced. They finished their work while Elias was still 10 feet deep in the ground, a solitary figure in a hole that seemed to have no bottom. Then, one afternoon, the sound from the pit changed. The dull thud of the pickaxe striking earth was replaced by a sharp, ringing crack, the sound of steel on stone. A different kind of silence fell over Elias's plot of land. He worked for another hour, clearing the last of the debris from the bottom of the pit. When he finally climbed out, his face was streaked with dirt, but his eyes held the look of profound satisfaction. He had found what he was looking for. He had reached bedrock. The next phase of his work was even more baffling to the onlookers. He spent a day sharpening tools, his file rasping against steel with a patient rhythm. Then he descended back into the pit with a heavy sledgehammer and a set of long, star-tipped drills. For the next week, the only sound from the folly was the relentless, ringing clang of a hammer striking a drill. He was boring holes into the solid stone at the bottom of the earth, a task so arduous that it seemed a form of madness. When he was done, he hammered long iron pins, salvaged from some forgotten piece of machinery, deep into the holes, anchoring them into the bedrock itself. Only then did he begin to build. His first logs were not laid on a bed of loose stone, but notched and fitted directly onto the iron pins that rose from the bottom of the pit. His foundation was not a part of the shifting soil. It was an extension of the ancient, unmoving stone that formed the core of the world.
From this central pillar, he began to build outward, laying massive foundation beams that spanned the pit and rested on carefully leveled stone piers, far from the central anchor. His cabin would not touch the ground in the traditional way. It would be anchored at its heart to the bedrock, and its edges would float above the frost-heaved soil. The structure that rose from this strange beginning was as unconventional as its anchor. Elias built 2 walls, not one, an inner wall of thick, carefully notched logs, and an outer wall of lighter timber, with a hand's width of space between them. He spent weeks gathering moss from the forest floor and collecting sawdust from the settlement's small mill. He packed this space between the walls with a dense, thick layer of insulation, a barrier against the cold that no one had ever thought to create. In the very center of the cabin, rising directly from the logs anchored to the bedrock, he began to construct a massive column of stone and clay. It was not a simple fireplace, but a complex, labyrinthine structure of flues and chambers, a masonry heater of a design he remembered from a book he had read years ago about the frozen steppes of the East. The idea was simple and elegant:
A short, hot fire burned once a day would heat the entire stone mass, which would then radiate a gentle, even warmth for the next 24 hours. The heat would be stored in the stone, not wasted up a chimney. This central mass was the heart of the house, locked to the bedrock, a thermal anchor as solid as its physical one. The men of Northwood had no frame of reference for what he was building. They saw a man burying his house in a hole, constructing walls of baffling thickness, and filling the center of his small home with a mountain of rock. It was inefficient. It was strange. It was wrong.
Silas came by one last time, just as Elias was fitting the roof beams. "You've worked harder than any 2 men in this valley, Elias," he said, his voice laced with a sad resignation. "I truly hope I am wrong, but when the ground freezes and that pillar of yours refuses to move while the rest of the earth swells up around it, this whole cabin is going to tear itself apart." Elias paused his work, looking at the earnest, worried face of the master builder. "The cabin will not tear itself apart," he said, with a certainty that was not arrogant, but absolute. "Because it is not fighting the ground. It is anchored to the one thing the frost can never touch." He placed a hand on the warm stone of the central chimney. "And the cold will not enter, because it will find no purchase." Silas shook his head and walked away. There was nothing more to be said. The folly was built. All that was left was for the winter to arrive and prove him right. The great storm arrived in the second week of January. It did not come with the fury of a blizzard, but with a terrifying, profound silence. The wind dropped to a whisper, and the sky turned a strange, luminous gray. Then the temperature began to fall. It did not drop. It plunged, as if the bottom had fallen out of the world. The settlers called it the white stillness, a cold so deep and so absolute that it seemed to be the very presence of death itself. Within 2 days, the thermometer on the trading post porch, the only one in the settlement, ceased to function, its mercury frozen solid in the bulb. The air grew so cold it hurt to breathe, each inhalation a sharp pain in the lungs. Trees in the forest, their sap frozen solid, began to split open with explosive cracks that sounded like rifle fire in the dead air. It was a cold that found every weakness, every tiny crack, every flaw in construction, and exploited it with merciless efficiency. For the families of Northwood, the siege had reached its brutal climax. The traditional cabins, which had already been groaning under the strain of the season, began to fail catastrophically. The frost heave, driven by the unprecedented cold, became a monstrous force. The sounds of splintering wood and popping nails became a nightly chorus of terror. Men stayed up all night, moving from one wall to another, stuffing rags and moss into the new cracks that appeared as their homes were slowly twisted apart. The cold that poured through these breaches was like a physical entity. It consumed heat greedily, forcing them to feed their stoves with a suicidal desperation. Woodpiles that were meant to last until March were gone by the end of the first week of the stillness. They began to burn fence posts, then furniture, then the very planks from their outbuildings. The cabins were filled with a frantic, fearful energy. Children cried from the cold, their parents' reassurances sounding hollow in the face of the encroaching chill. Silas's cabin, one of the best built in the settlement, was suffering as much as any other. A main support beam in his foundation had shifted, and a diagonal crack had opened up in the wall of his main room, wide enough to see the gray daylight through. He had nailed a thick blanket over it, but it was like trying to stop a river with a handkerchief. The cold flowed around it, a constant, invisible waterfall of Arctic air. His wife and 3 children were huddled around the stove, wrapped in every blanket they owned, their faces pinched and blue. He had burned the last of his spare lumber. Soon, he would have to start breaking up the chairs. He looked at the pale face of his youngest son and felt a kind of despair he had never known. His expertise, his experience, his pride, it was all worthless. The winter was winning.
Amidst this widespread desperation, the cabin at the edge of the settlement stood silent. From the outside, Elias's home looked half buried in snow, a quiet mound against the gray sky. No frantic plumes of smoke poured from its chimney, only a thin, lazy wisp that spoke of a slow, steady fire within. No sounds of hammering or shouting came from its walls. It was an island of profound and unnerving calm in the midst of the settlement's agony. Inside, the world was transformed. The white stillness held no power here. The air was not hot, not stuffy, but filled with a gentle, pervasive warmth that seemed to radiate from the very bones of the house. The massive stone heater in the center of the room was warm to the touch, a benign and constant presence. Once in the morning, Elias had burned a small, hot fire of seasoned hardwood for less than an hour. The stone had absorbed the heat, and now, 12 hours later, it was still releasing it into the room. There were no drafts. The double walls, packed with their thick insulation, formed an impenetrable barrier. The windows, carefully sealed, showed no trace of the frost flowers that coated every other pane of glass in the valley. The floor was cool, but not cold, raised as it was above the frozen ground. And most importantly, the cabin was still. It did not groan or creak. It did not shift. Anchored to the bedrock, deep below the reach of the frost, it was as solid and unmoving as the mountain itself. Anna was not huddled by the fire. She sat at a small wooden table, drawing on a piece of slate, her feet tucked comfortably beneath her. She wore a simple wool dress, not a mountain of blankets. In her father's house, the winter was just something to look at through the window. It was not a threat. The stark contrast was absolute. In the village, families were fighting a desperate, losing battle for survival inside structures that were failing them. They were consuming fuel at an alarming rate, only to feel the cold seeping deeper into their homes. The interior of Silas's cabin struggled to stay above freezing. The interior of Elias's cabin was a steady 60 degrees. In the village, there was fear and frenetic activity. In Elias's cabin, there was peace and a quiet, steady warmth. He had used less than a quarter of the wood that his neighbors had already burned through. His victory was not loud or dramatic. It was silent, calm, and complete. On the 10th day of the stillness, Silas knew he was defeated. He had burned the kitchen table, and the cold was still winning. He looked at his wife, her face etched with fear, and at his shivering children, and his pride finally broke. It shattered into 1,000 pieces, swept away by a father's primal fear. He had been wrong. He, the master builder, the man everyone trusted, had been catastrophically, dangerously wrong. And the quiet fool in the hole, the man they had all laughed at, had been right. There was only one thing left to do. He bundled himself in every layer of clothing he owned and stepped out into the brutal cold. The short walk to Elias's property was a journey through an alien landscape. The air was so still and heavy, it felt like moving through water. His breath froze instantly on his beard. When he reached the strange, low-slung cabin, he hesitated for a moment, his hand hovering before the door. He was about to admit the greatest failure of his life. He knocked. The door swung open, and the first thing that struck Silas was not a person, but a sensation. It was a wave of calm, even warmth, that washed over him, so profoundly different from the harsh, dry heat of an overworked stove that it felt like a different element entirely. It was not the heat of a battle, but the warmth of a sanctuary. He saw Elias standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. Beyond him, he saw the little girl, Anna, looking up from her slate, her cheeks rosy and her eyes clear. There was no fear in this house. Silas stumbled inside, pulling the door shut against the terrible cold behind him. He looked around the single, open room, his builder's eye taking in the impossible reality of it. The smooth, solid walls, the clean, frost-free windows, the utter stillness of the structure. He ran a hand along the inner wall, feeling for a draft, and found nothing. He placed his palm flat against the central stone pillar. It was not hot, just deeply, wonderfully warm, like a sun-baked rock in late summer. He was so overcome by the simple, peaceful reality of the place that he could not speak. Elias did not boast. He did not say, "I told you so." He did not wear a triumphant smirk. His face showed only a quiet, weary compassion. He gestured to a simple wooden stool near the stone heater. "Sit," he said. His voice was the calmest sound Silas had heard in a week. "You are welcome here." Silas sank onto the stool, the warmth seeping into his frozen limbs. He looked from the sleeping child to the steady, quiet man who had built this impossible refuge. The full weight of his own ignorance, his own loud, confident, and utterly mistaken pride, crashed down on him. He, who had mocked this man, was now seeking shelter in his creation. The irony was as bitter as the cold he had just fled. "How?" Silas finally managed to whisper, his voice hoarse. "There is no frost. The walls do not creak. How?" Elias sat down opposite him. He did not begin with a lecture. He simply began to explain. "The ground heaves because the water in the soil freezes and expands," he said, his voice as methodical as his work had been. "It has immense power, but it only has that power in the first 10 or 15 feet of soil. Below that, the earth is stable. Its temperature does not change." He paused, letting the simple fact settle in. "I did not try to fight the frost. I simply built on a place the frost could not reach." He went on to explain the rest of it. The central pillar, anchored to the bedrock, held the house in place, an unmoving spine. The outer structure rested on piers that allowed the frozen ground to swell and shrink beneath it without touching the main floor. The double walls and the insulation did not generate heat. They simply kept the heat they had from escaping. The masonry stove was a battery for warmth, storing it in its great mass and releasing it slowly. It was a system, a series of simple, logical ideas working in concert. It was not magic. It was engineering. Silas listened, his head bowed. Each word was a revelation, dismantling a lifetime of accepted wisdom. He had always seen a house as a fortress, a solid object fighting against the winter. Elias had built a vessel, one that was anchored securely, but designed to float on the turbulent sea of the frozen earth. One that did not fight the cold, but simply refused to acknowledge it. He was wrong. It was the most liberating and humiliating realization of his life. When the white stillness finally broke, retreating as silently as it had arrived, word of Silas's visit to Elias's cabin spread through the settlement like wildfire. It was carried on whispers of disbelief and rumor. Silas, the proudest man in Northwood, seeking shelter with the fool? It seemed impossible. But the evidence was undeniable. Silas had taken his family to Elias's cabin for the last 2 days of the storm, and others who had made the trek to check on the quiet man had found the same impossible scene. A warm, peaceful home, untouched by the ravages of the cold. Curiosity overcame skepticism. One by one, then in small groups, the settlers made their way to Elias's cabin. They came not to mock, but to see. They knocked hesitantly on his door, and he welcomed each of them inside. The reaction was always the same. They would step across the threshold and stop, their faces a mixture of shock and awe as the calm, steady warmth enveloped them. They would touch the walls, stare at the frost-free windows, and place their hands on the warm stone of the central heater. They saw Anna playing contentedly, a living testament to the success of her father's design. The laughter was gone, replaced by a profound and respectful silence. They had come to see a folly and had found a miracle. A few days later, Silas returned, but he did not come for shelter. He came alone, walking with the heavy tread of a man on a solemn mission. He found Elias outside, splitting wood with the same steady rhythm he applied to all tasks. Silas stood before him, his hat in his hands, and for a long moment he said nothing. He was a man unaccustomed to humility, and the words did not come easily. "I was wrong," Silas said finally, his voice low but clear. "Everything I knew was wrong. I built my house to fight the winter, and I almost lost my family. You built yours to understand it, and you lived in peace." He met Elias's calm gaze. "What you have done here, it is more than just a good cabin. It is the answer. It is the only answer for this land." He took a deep breath. "Teach me." It was a request that cost him his pride, but it was also the wisest thing he had ever said. Elias stopped his work and leaned the axe against the chopping block. He looked at Silas, the man who had led the chorus of mockery, and saw not an enemy, but a neighbor, a father, a man who was willing to unlearn a lifetime of error for the sake of his family. Elias nodded. "There is nothing to teach that the stone and the cold cannot show you," he said. "But I will share what I have learned." He did not ask for payment or praise. He did not demand an apology. He simply began to share his knowledge freely and openly. He knelt and drew diagrams in the dirt with a stick, showing Silas the principles of the bedrock anchor, the raised floor, and the insulated double wall. He explained the physics of thermal mass, how a large, dense object could absorb and radiate heat far more efficiently than an open fire. He took Silas inside and showed him the intricate flue system within the masonry heater, explaining how it captured every last bit of warmth from the smoke before letting it escape. He held nothing back. His knowledge was not a secret to be hoarded, but a tool to be shared for the survival of them all. The spring that followed the white stillness was a season of unprecedented change in Northwood. The thaw revealed the full extent of the damage the winter had wrought. Every single one of the old cabins was severely damaged, their foundations shattered, their walls warped. But this year, there was no talk of patching and resetting. There was a new energy in the settlement, a feeling of hope born from a harsh lesson. Under the guidance of Elias and the enthusiastic leadership of a converted Silas, the community began to rebuild. But they did not start by felling trees. They started by digging. All across the settlement, men began to excavate, not shallow trenches, but deep, focused pits, searching for the bedrock that Elias had shown them was their true foundation. The landscape was dotted with these new, strange holes in the ground, each one a testament to a revolution in thinking. Silas, the former master of the old way, became the most dedicated student of the new. He worked alongside Elias, absorbing every detail, asking questions, and experimenting with improvements. He became the foreman of this great rebuilding, his booming voice no longer directing the construction of flawed structures, but guiding his neighbors in the principles of a design that worked with nature, not against it. The physical appearance of the settlement began to change. The new cabins were lower, more solid, looking as if they grew from the earth rather than sitting precariously on top of it. The story of what had happened in Northwood began to travel. A government surveyor, mapping the territory that summer, was astonished by the unique construction of the new cabins. He stayed for a week, filling his notebook with sketches and details of the Northwood Foundation, as he called it. He listened to the story of the quiet man who had dug a hole to bedrock and the great cold that had proven him right. His report, filed back in the Capitol, was passed among engineers and architects. Articles began to appear in newspapers and journals in the East,
telling the tale of the remote settlement that had solved the problem of the permafrost. The idea spread, a quiet and powerful current of knowledge. Settlers in other northern territories, hearing the story, began to experiment with the design. The bedrock cabin became a new standard for construction in the unforgiving North. The legacy of Elias's work was not a statue or a plaque, but 1,000 warm and stable homes, filled with families who no longer had to live in fear of the winter. His innovation became the new tradition. Elias himself never changed. He remained a quiet, humble man, content to live his life at the edge of the settlement. He sought no credit and accepted no special status.
When people thanked him, he would simply nod and say that the bedrock had always been there, waiting. He had not invented anything, he insisted. He had merely observed what the world was willing to teach. His greatest satisfaction came not from the vindication of his ideas, but from the sight of a settlement where the sound of children laughing had replaced the sound of shivering, and where the smoke rose lazily from the chimneys of warm, safe homes. The story of Elias and his folly that became a foundation lived on for generations, a piece of local lore that held a profound and simple truth. It served as a reminder that the loudest voices are not always the wisest, and that established tradition is no match for careful observation. It taught that true strength is not found in fighting the world, but in understanding it, in finding the unmoving center upon which a life or a home can be securely built. The greatest wisdom, the story went, often comes from the quietest corners, from the one person willing to dig deeper than anyone else, searching not for what is easy, but for what is true.